All right, it's loaded after 1:30 here in Alaska, so time to start our Wildlife Wednesday. Again, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Wildlife Wednesday presentation with the Center for Wildlife Studies. My name is Jeff Stetz. I'm the Director of Science and Assistant Professor here at the Center. As I say every month, one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to help coordinate this series where we invite our colleagues and collaborators and instructors from the Center to talk about their work, whether it's the education, conservation practitioners, research. In this case, it's the third part of our behavior and conservation series. And this time we're shifting to wildlife behavior instead of human behavior a little bit. So with that, and I want to know if folks come in and have questions, will be time after the presentation to deal with any questions. And if you are not able to finish the talk today, we do record these and post them to our YouTube channel. So give us about a week or so for that. But then please feel free to share those with folks who may not have been lucky enough to join us today. Today, as I said, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Stefanie Wilks to Wildlife Wednesday. Stefanie is a biologist and educator who is fascinated by the behind-the-scenes look at how birds grow and thrive. Her research dives into the world of molecular ecology, where she looks at how a bird's early environment, and even its parents, can shape its stress response and behavior for a lifetime through epigenetic processes. Topic very close to home, as we were just discussing. When she isn't uncovering the secrets of avian biology, Stefanie is a lecturer at Columbia University and a valued instructor here at the Center for Wildlife Studies. She's a firm believer that science should be for everyone. Working from the American Museum of Natural History to classrooms across the globe, Stefanie works to maintain accessible science that's inclusive and inspiring for all. For those of you looking to dive deeper into the world of animal behavior and Stefanie's work, she'll be teaching her wonderful class with CWS in June, which is titled Applied Wildlife Behavior for Conservation, Data Design and Decision Making, which is a fantastic opportunity to learn more about how behavioral data can be used to help address conservation challenges and have real world results. And I'll be putting links in the chat for our class and for other Wildlife Wednesday recordings and whatnot. But with that, I will hand it over to Stefanie.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. So really nice to meet you all. Thank you guys all for having me. So I'm Dr. Stefanie Wilks, and today I'm excited to talk a little bit about how we can use animal behavior to really understand and help solve conservation challenges. And I have a couple kind of prompts as we go through, so you're welcome to drop answers in the chat as we go. So as we start, if there's any animal behaviors you've seen recently or that you find interesting, feel free to drop those in the chat. And this is going to be a little bit of kind of a primer for the course that I will be teaching this summer on how we can apply wildlife behavior for conservation. And so in this course, we're going to dive deeper into actually analyzing data, kind of learning and developing the practical skills that we need to actually apply animal behavior to meeting real life conservation challenges. So we're going to do kind of an introduction of that today, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So, animal behavior is an amazing and fascinating field where we learn about how and why animals interact, communicate, and make decisions the way that they do. So, why gray-crowned cranes have such an intricate courtship ritual, how blue-footed boobies maximize offspring survival through their parenting decisions, what drives male springboks to these fierce physical competitions, and what evolutionary adaptations enable a hare to help escape from a predator. And personally, I find learning about these behaviors fascinating for its own sake, but here we're really going to think about how understanding these behaviors can really be used for conservation purposes. And this is becoming increasingly more important in our world that is shaped so much by human activity through land use change, urbanization, and climate change. Wildlife now faces unprecedented challenges. So understanding how animals are impacted by these pressures really requires a solid grasp of their behavior. And as species respond and adapt to us, they might elicit new behaviors that can also potentially lead to escalating human-wildlife conflict. So by studying animal behavior, we can really design strategies that try to minimize harm and help foster coexistence. So before we get started, it's helpful, I think, to think about what behavior actually is. What do we mean when we talk about animal behavior? And this is not as straightforward a question as we might imagine. The definition of behavior has really evolved a lot and continues to evolve a lot over time. So Just as an example of this, in the early field of ethology, it was defined as the total movements made by an intact animal. It has also been described as what an animal or a plant does. It has been defined as how an organism responds to stimulation, the observable activity of an organism, anything that involves action in response to stimulation, any externally visible activity of an animal, how they respond to external and internal conditions, a response to external and internal stimuli that has a genetic basis and that is also subject to natural selection and can be modified through experience, or all observable or other measurable responses that are in response to some change in either the internal or external environment. So again, we can really see, right, behavior as a definition has changed and evolved a lot over time from the total movements of an animal to every response an animal makes in response to the internal or the external environment. And you might agree or disagree with some of these definitions, and they will likely continue to change based on how we use them. But what we can really agree on is that behavior lies at the center of the gene and the environment. Behavioral traits are the product of genetic diversity, and they're really heavily influenced by the environment. So behavior is what allows individuals and populations, so not just individuals, but groups as well, to respond to environmental change. And it therefore plays a really important role in shaping the properties and functions of communities and of ecosystems. So it's a really important contributor to how an organism survives and reproduces, to how a population can persist, and to how diverse an ecosystem is. So now that we have a little primer on behavior, how do we actually go about studying behavior? And again, if you're interested in diving into the weeds of this, please look to my course. But here we'll just do a really brief overview of some of the general methods we use when we try to study behavior. So first, we can take an observational approach. We can just watch animals as they behave. This can be done in the field or in the lab, and we often use what's called an ethogram here, which is where we take an inventory of all of the behaviors that are being exhibited by the animal, and then we relate those behaviors to their social or their ecological environment. We can also take an experimental approach where we manipulate features of the animal or the environment, also in the field or in the lab, and then we can make really causal statements about how something that we changed impacted the behavior that we're viewing. And then finally, we can take a comparative approach where we can generalize ideas beyond a single species, and we can look at how related or closely related animals might be similar or different in terms of behavior. And all three of these approaches can be used to answer questions about animal behavior. And this really gets to the crux of when we study behavior is that we really need to make sure we are asking the right question. The research question that we ask is going to identify essentially the area of uncertainty that we're trying to address. It's going to determine the kind of data we need to collect, whether we're in the lab or the field, how we're recording things, for how long are we recording things? Do we need to record an individual or a group? What kind of equipment we need? Basically, how successful your research project is will depend on if you ask the right question. So I'm going to ask you all to kind of put on your animal behavior hats for a moment, and we are going to observe a behavior. And you can drop in the chat or just think about what are you observing as you watch this, and what kind of questions might you ask about this behavior? So let's take a look. Watch it one more time. So here we have a gull who is performing a type of behavior, and there's a lot of questions that we can ask about what this gull is doing and why. And so when we ask questions about behavior, we break these down into essentially two different categories. So the first are how level questions or proximate level questions. So these can be questions about essentially what mechanisms are causing this behavior. So what muscles are involved in the bird doing this? What aspects of its nervous system are being instigated here? What cues or triggers are being sensed to start or end the behavior? We can also ask about how it develops. So does the bird need to learn this behavior from other individuals? Does it need to practice and improve on the behavior over a certain amount of time? And then we can also ask why level questions or ultimate level questions. So we can think about how the behavior evolved. We can look at similar species of birds and say, do they also have this behavior? And then finally, we can look at the behavior's function. Does it increase the bird's survival and reproduction? So does performing this behavior more vigorously maybe increase its ability to survive or to get food or to attract more mates? And so these are all these types of questions can be used to study animal behavior in general, but they can also be really useful for when we want to apply our questions about behavior to conservation. So the framework that we're going to use for our talk today was put forth by Berger-Tall et al. In 2011, and it looks at how behavior and conservation can really go hand in hand. So we're going to start by thinking about the different types of behaviors that we can observe here. So things related to movement, habitat use, foraging, avoiding predators, being a predator, sociality, reproduction. And we'll think about first how anthropogenic activity can impact these various types of behavior. We'll also then talk about how these behaviors can actually be used as indicators that can tell us about issues that are of conservation concern. And then finally, we'll talk about how we can incorporate these behaviors into behavior-based management and use them for our conservation purposes. So this is going to be the general outline of what we're going to talk about today. So how humans impact animal behavior, how we use behavior to help uncover conservation issues, and then how we can use it to help solve those conservation challenges. So we'll get started with how humans impact animal behavior. And so anthropogenic activities impact animal behavior in a myriad of ways. But when we talk about anthropogenic impacts here, what we generally mean are human disturbances. And these disturbances can come in a lot of different forms. So some of the biggest impacts are things like habitat or land use change, where we're altering the environment an animal relies on, so often through fragmentation or destruction. We might also overexploit an animal. Overexploitation has been driven by this huge increase in human population alongside our technological improvements that have made us really good at harvesting. And this has led to an increased depletion of a lot of species, especially large mammals and fish. Human activities have also distributed, intentionally or not, a large number of species throughout the world far beyond their native ranges. And when these species succeed in establishing themselves, they can also have a really damaging impact on the native biodiversity there, either directly through competition or predation, or more indirectly by changing aspects of the environment. Pollutants can also have really wide-ranging impacts on animals. They change the biogeochemical composition of ecosystems, they interfere with ecosystem processes, and they can directly impact survival and reproduction when animals come in contact with them. And then finally, no talk here would be complete without a mention of climate change, one of the most pressing concerns of today. It can affect biodiversity directly by making species maladapted to their new environments, or more indirectly by altering the ecosystems that they are in. So all of these different disturbances, all of these different activities are going to change how adaptive a particular behavior is for its environment. And we can consider essentially three ways in which these human activities can impact behavior. So first, they might modify the risks that animals are encountering. So from humans, from predators, or from things like disease and pathogens, as well as their opportunities for finding mates, for finding resources, or for other social interactions. Human activity will disrupt the detection and assessment of cues. So, for instance, when the environment changes, so too does communication within that environment and how animals are actually assessing the cues that they need for social communication. And then finally, it will constrain behavioral options. So, their ability to move through the environment, their ability to find and mate successfully. And these are subsequently going to impact how an animal behaves in relationship to both its spatial environment and its social environment. So human disturbance frequently changes the availability of resources, for instance. And this is a really important part of of an animal's spatial environment. And often human activity limits the availability of resources. And we'll see an example of this in more detail in a moment. But in other cases, we also provide additional food. So the production of agriculture or intentional or unintentional feeding. And these things can cause animals to enter new areas, to group together in new ways, to interact with humans or with each other in ways that they previously did not. And changes in resource availability can then impact social behavior, like competition for mates or for resources, which can also impact other behaviors like aggression. And then finally, other aspects of the social environment can also be impacted by things like pollution, which might alter or mask cues that are really important for communication. So noise pollution, for instance, has been shown to severely impact how whales communicate with their groups, and then this can impact spatial behaviors as well, like migration and navigation. So these relationships are all very related, and we're going to look at a couple in a little bit more detail here. So first, let's look at how anthropogenic activity impacts migration. So migrants are animals who traverse really long distances and over multiple habitat types. And one of the main threats to migratory species is habitat loss. And this is particularly harmful for migrants because they're already really stressed. They're traveling really long distances. They're doing an incredible thing that requires a ton of energy. And if they don't have abundant and predictable food along the way, this can be really detrimental to them. So as an example of this, we can look at the red knot, which is a bird that migrates from South America to breeding grounds in the Arctic. And along the way, there are populations that stop in the Delaware Bay, where they rely on horseshoe crab eggs to fuel their journey. However, rampant overharvesting of these eggs by fishermen who use them as bait caused egg levels to fall by 90% in the Delaware Bay. And as a result, the red knot population also fell by 75%. Fortunately, behavioral biologists helped develop management plans to rebuild the horseshoe crab population and help sustain the population of red knots. And this can be really tricky to deal with migrants overall because they often have stopover sites that require coordination between different countries, but we have been successful at this. So in 1983, there was the Convention on Migratory Species signed by 70 countries that aimed to conserve migratory species throughout their range. And under this agreement, many conservation and management research activities have been undertaken for not only birds, but also other species like bats and turtles. So we have been successful in actually meeting some of the anthropogenic impacts on migration. Now, another major impact of human activity is habitat fragmentation, which creates something called the edge effect. So essentially, when we fragment a habitat by building different roads or infrastructure, we increase the amount of edge that that habitat has. And this can have a really big impact on behavior because edges are very different in terms of their structure and their composition. So for instance, a forest edge has a lot more open canopy, an increased understory density, and different tree species composition. And so animal behaviors are going to change because now they have different resources, different shelters, different breeding habitats. Some animals really like edges. Predators, for instance, might find them easier to hunt along, whereas prey often tend to avoid them because it's easier to be hunted. So we can look at an example of a study that was done on bat activities in stands and forest edges. So managed pine forests are a really large part of the southeastern US, but the effects of this type of management on different communities is not as well understood. So scientists wanted to know, well, what is the impact of these types of forests on bat communities? How is bat foraging behavior impacted by the edge habitat that's created by this type of forest management? So researchers used audio data to record overall activity and feeding activity in different stand types and along forest edges. And here we can see some of their results. And this is showing the relative amount of bat activity along forest edges. So the lighter bars are when they're in edges, the darker bars are when they were in the interior of the forests. And what's really notable about this is that there were really different results for different species. So some species, like the hoary bat here, really liked foraging on the edge. They spent most of their time on the edge. but Myotis species avoided the edge. So some species increased foraging behavior along edges, others avoided it. And this is going to be really important when we consider the impacts of different habitat use changes on different species behavior. So overall, we can see right edge effects can have significant impacts on how animals behave. And by understanding these types of things, we can help develop more targeted strategies to mitigate potentially negative effects and protect vulnerable species. So these are just a few examples, right, of how anthropogenic activity can impact animal behavior. This could be its own talk, its own class, all on its own. But I really want to focus now on how we can use our understanding of behavior for conservation purposes. So we're going to dive now into looking at how behavior can actually be used to tell us about potential risks in the environment. And so here we're going to be talking about something called behavioral indicators, which essentially provide a pointer to which processes might be of conservation concern. So behavioral indicators can help reveal conservation threats and alert us to early population declines or degradation of habitats, and they can help us also monitor how well a management program is going. So first, let's just think about what makes a good conservation indicator in general. Well, it should provide an early warning for an environmental impact. It should indicate not just that there is a change happening, but what the cause of that change actually is. It should provide continuous assessment over a wide range of stresses and time. It should have a minimum of false alarms, so it should be pretty reliable, and hopefully it should be simple and cost effective to actually measure. And animal behaviors really meet most, if not all, of these requirements. Because animals usually exhibit a behavioral reaction to how the environment changes. And this is often a lot easier to see and a lot earlier to see than things like a demographic response. The nature of this behavioral change can also, in many cases, give information about the cause, not just that it's happening. Most behaviors can be measured on a continuous scale, so we can actually get a continuous assessment of change. If we have a good knowledge and understanding of a species' life history and their behavior, then this can help minimize those false alarms and make these indicators much more reliable. And in many cases, behaviors are much easier and more cost-effective to monitor than things like determining the distribution and abundance of species. So as we go ahead and talk a little bit about behavior as an indicator, I want you guys to just think about what some of the limitations might be to using behavior as an indicator. And we'll come back to this at the end of this section. So behavioral indicators can be taken at an individual level by measuring what we call an animal's or aspects of an animal's welfare, which is essentially their state in regard to how well they're coping with their environment. So we're going to put our animal behavior hats back on again. We're going to watch a short part of a video that was taken of a polar bear seen by National Geographic photographer Paul Nicklin while he was on expedition in the Baffin Islands in Canada. This video is pretty widely shared, so you might have seen this before already. And again, we're just going to watch a short amount of the clip. But the reason I want to watch this is because I want you guys to think, as we're watching it, about the observations you can make about this individual's condition, about their welfare, just based off of the video that we're going to watch. So let's take a look. All right, so again, just a short clip there, but just from that, right, we can make some observations about this individual's condition. It seems to be moving pretty slowly, weak, in a poor body condition. It might be pretty stressed out. And so there are some pretty clear things we can say about this individual just by observing it. But an animal's welfare is connected to not just that animal, but also to larger level processes. So the population dynamics and the environmental quality kind of set the context in which this animal is existing in. So they are going to have a really big impact on that animal's welfare. So if we collect data on an individual animal and we look for changes over time, especially concerning changes in how they're behaving, then we can not only say something about the individual, but also about the population and about the environment that are impacting that individual. So by observing this video, we can tell a lot about this bear, but we can also use these observations to start to ask questions about the population and the environment overall. So first, we can look at something like the population size. Maybe this bear is in poor condition because there's overcrowding in the habitat, which can lead to aggression or competition for resources or increased disease transmission. We can also look at if there's been a change in age and sex ratios, which can really affect social dynamics. So sometimes if there's too many males in a group, this can increase conflict and aggression. Or if there's a lack of experienced adults, then we can see an impairment of the cultural transmission of behaviors that are needed for survival. We can also look at aspects of the environment, so especially things like resource availability. If the environment is poor or degraded and there's not enough resources, then individuals will suffer from nutritional stress, which can lower body condition and immunity. And we can also look at aspects of the abiotic environment, so heat stress, cold stress, if there's enough shelter or shade, because these things can have physiological impacts on welfare as well. And of course, all of these factors are related, right? So if our environment declines, population densities may crash, and those animals are going to experience poorer welfare through hunger, through stress, or through displacement. So essentially, by monitoring an individual's behavior, we can really start to ask questions about the population and the environment that can point us to potential conservation issues. So let's take an example here by looking at foraging behaviors. A lot of indicators relate to foraging because eating is a really important part of what animals do. It takes up a lot of their time, it's critical to their survival, and it involves a lot of behaviors that can reveal aspects of the individual, the population, and the environment. So for instance, we can look at the diet choice that an animal is making. We can ask what food choices are they making and how are these choices changing over space and time? For instance, if a population tends to specialize in one food and then they start expanding to other types, that might indicate something about the population growth or about the availability of these resources in the environment. For instance, mule deer really like to eat aspen, but as their population in the early 20th century was increasing, it was noted that they started to eat from other conifer types as well, and this continued up until their population ended up crashing. So by understanding how they were changing their diet choices, this actually could have predicted the fact that their population was getting too large. Another example is in cottontail rabbits, who typically eat grasses and forbs in the summer, and then in the winter, when food is scarcer, they start to strip bark from shrubs. And so if behavior like bark feeding is seen during the summer, this would indicate that this population is particularly food stressed. Similarly, assessments of habitat selection and patch use can be used to assess animal and environmental conditions. We can ask, where are animals obtaining food? Or where are their homes? Where are they choosing to reside? So for example, we can look at hyraxes in South Africa. These are animals who live in these rocky refuges and then they venture out into the landscape to eat. And they often choose to forage close to home because there's a really high risk of predation. But if we start to see changes in those foraging choices, if they start moving further away to eat, this could indicate that there's been a change maybe in their habitat quality, or maybe there's less predators around. Another example is in muskrats, who change their habitat choices depending as to whether they're at low or high population densities. So when they're at lower densities, they tend to use burrows along deeper waters as their dens. But when densities get too high, they start to spill over into shallower water vegetation. So space use and habitat choice can be really useful indicators of how the population is doing, as well as how the environment is doing. Another often used measure is vigilance. This is essentially when a forager stops eating and instead starts to look around and look for predators in the space around it. And when foragers are exploiting a depletable resource patch, they must essentially choose to allocate their time to one of these two things. So we can ask, how are animals splitting their time between eating versus scanning for predators? Because rates of vigilance can be used to detect changes not only in the foragers, but also in the predators. So this was done in a study on snow leopards, which are very elusive and hard to study. So instead, researchers aimed to quantify the vigilance behavior of their main prey. And this allowed them to assess the population of snow leopards and to determine their locations and their habitat preferences. So these are some nice examples of how we can use foraging or metrics of foraging as behavioral indicators. Another really great behavioral indicator that can be particularly useful in relation to communication are bioacoustics. These can reveal perturbations in the environment or to the population that might be really hard to find otherwise and can be really useful for conservation biologists. So first, traditional monitoring of some species is just hard to do. Perhaps, they're in an environment that's really hard to reach. Maybe their behaviors are just really elusive and hard to capture. And so bioacoustic monitoring can be really useful for detecting these individuals and their behaviors. So, for instance, recordings of the clicks of sperm whales helped researchers determine essentially how much time they were spending socializing and foraging, and they could then assess variation in these behaviors over space and time. So if we monitor acoustics, we can start to uncover behaviors that might indicate the state of the individuals or of the groups that are really relevant to conservation and can be used to help inform decisions. Bioacoustic behaviors can also reveal threatening processes, and we can use them as kind of warning systems for a population decline. So vocal behaviors can signal things about habitat quality or reproductive success. So an example of this was done in European storm petrels, where passive acoustic monitoring of adult call rates was used as a useful metric for how many chicks there were, and therefore how successful breeding was. So it was a really nice non-invasive way to measure how productive a population was just by monitoring the adult calls, instead of actually needing to go into the nest themselves to see how breeding was going. Then finally, these behaviors can provide a means to monitor and evaluate how effective a conservation action is, which is really critical for effective conservation planning and adaptive management. So a nice example of this was done in the Sierra Nevada, where researchers used microphone recording units and a machine learning algorithm called BirdNet to analyze bird calls and determine how they related to different forest conditions, and this helped forest managers to make better informed decisions by using this information. So as we've seen, right, behavioral indicators like foraging, like bioacoustics, can tell us about the individual and their welfare, but they can also tell us about larger level population and environmental processes. Behavior can serve as a really useful indicator for a community shift. Species are constantly interacting with one another through predation, through competition, through cooperation. So any change in the behavior of one species is likely going to reflect shifts in the composition or structure of the whole community. So a really famous, well-known example of this is when we released wolves to Yellowstone. And it had a really large impact on the behavior of elk, on their vigilance, on their movement, and on their foraging. And this in turn caused a trophic cascade that impacted other members of the community of Yellowstone, such as birds and small mammals, and how they were using the environment. So this demonstrates how the behavioral trait of one species can drive behavioral and ecological shifts in the rest of the community. Behavioral indicators can also be used as tools to monitor ecosystem health. They can provide an early warning for when an ecosystem is deteriorating, and we can use them to help prevent collapse. So behaviors can be useful indicators for things like pollution. So we use something called behavioral ecotoxicology, which is when we can use behavior to determine if there's a detrimental substance that's impacting an organism or the health of the ecosystem. One of the first examples of this was in observations of the American bald eagle. So between 1952 and 1957, researchers found that there were a lot of changes in the reproductive behavior of the eagle, and this was followed by a really sharp decline in their reproductive success. And this was actually one of the first indicators for the dangers of DDT and other chemical pollutants. Behavioral indicators can also be used to monitor ecosystem health outside of pollutants and provide an early warning for an ecosystem collapse. And this is essentially when stressors in an ecosystem cause a regime shift where a really complex ecosystem really quickly transforms into a simple one, where there's a lot less species, a lot less interactions between those species. And once a system collapses, it can happen really suddenly, it can be really hard to predict, and it can be very difficult to restore. But behaviors can actually be useful indicators that a system is heading towards a collapse. So, for instance, changes in the territorial behavior of these species of butterfly fish in the Seychelles Islands were found to precede when a coral bleaching event was about to happen. So it suggests that this behavioral change in their territorial behavior could actually be an indicator for an ecosystem shift that's about to happen. And then finally, behavior can be used as an indicator for more global level processes, especially those related to climate change. Climate change can impact how species associate with specific habitats. So, for instance, coming back to our polar bear, they have become less associated with ice and more associated with land and open water. Another important behavioral indicator are changes to phenology. So phenology refers to essentially life history temporal patterns. So, when you leave from your wintering grounds, or when you start courtship, or when you start or initiate breeding. And climate change is altering the phenology of different species, but often in different ways. And so this creates what we call a phenological mismatch. So for instance, if you're a bird and you know, okay, I have to leave at this time of year to get to my breeding site, and that's when there's going to be food available for me to start laying my eggs and raise my offspring. If that gets mistimed with when there's actually food available, if the insects are late to emerge, if there's not enough vegetation around, then they might reach their grounds and not actually have what they need to successfully raise offspring. And so climate change is really altering this phenology of different species. And so different behaviors can actually serve as an indicator of these phenological mismatches. And so we've come to, see how behavior can be a really useful indicator for things about the population and for things about the environment, but there are limitations, as there always are. So using behavior as an indicator is going to be limited by the fact that behavior varies a lot, particularly between sexes, between age groups, and across time, across seasons. So we have to be very careful that we're taking into account individual variation in behavior, and that if we're seeing a change or a different behavior, that we know that it is because of the population or the environment and not something that is just an individual difference. We also need really good baseline data to make comparisons too. It's really hard to say that something has changed, that we're seeing a concerning pattern if we don't have an actual baseline to compare it back to. So having good baseline behavioral data is going to be really important. And then in some cases, especially for elusive species or behaviors that are really hard to see, measuring behavior might actually be more difficult. So in these cases, we need to really pair these behavioral indicators with other types of indicators, and they can't really be used on their own. Okay, so we've talked about how humans impact animal behavior. We've talked about how we can use behavior to really uncover conservation issues related to the population or to the environment. So now we're going to talk about how we use behavior to actually solve conservation challenges. And this is what we call behavior-based management, where behavior is used in conservation practice. So species behavior can be considered when we make conservation decisions and when we design protocols. So when we're making reserves, when we're doing reintroductions, when we're trying to control invasive species, we really want to consider all of the behaviors involved. And then in some cases, it's the behavior itself that's the issue. And here we really need to think about how we can change or modify the behavior for a conservation purpose. So first, we'll think about how we use behavior to inform conservation action. So behavior is going to be really critical when we do things like try to design a protected area. We need to consider factors related to how animals perceive their environment, move through their environment, and otherwise use their environment. So what habitat features do they need for eating, for avoiding predators, for reproducing? What cues are going to help them move through the environment or impede them from moving through the environment? How are things like noise and light and chemical pollutions going to impact their communication? And then importantly, when do we actually have a mismatch between what we as biologists perceive as a good habitat and what animals actually perceive as a good habitat? So a nice example of this comes from management of the Beersheba fringe-fingered lizard, which is an endemic species to the northern Negev desert in Israel. And the forestry department had begun an afforestation project where they were essentially creating a mosaic landscape in this area. But they found that the lizard started to decline and it was listed as critically endangered. And interestingly, it was declining in both types of habitats. So not just the managed afforested habitats, but its natural ones as well. So it was really unclear about whether this was due to the management project itself. So researchers looked at this and they found that these afforested managed areas were actually providing improved hunting habitat for birds of prey. But this was not a threat that these juvenile lizards were used to. So they didn't actually perceive this increased threat. So what was happening is these afforested patches had really high predation, and then they were leading to vacancies that were attracting new juveniles. So it was creating what we call an ecological trap, and it was leading to declines in both of these types of habitats. And the researchers further tested and confirmed this with a controlled experiment. And this was enough for managers to actually no longer expand the afforestation project and to instead establish a sanctuary surrounded by buffer zones to help protect the lizard. And we can also use behavior to help mitigate human-wildlife conflict. So here we can ask questions like what behavioral characteristics might predict that there will be conflict with people, and how can we help mitigate and reduce this conflict by thinking about behavior and using aspects of behavior. So a nice example of this comes from Kenya, where there's often conflict between farmers and free-ranging elephants because elephants tend to encroach on the agriculture being grown by farmers for food. And so a really innovative method was created to help mitigate this conflict by utilizing the fact that elephants have a fear of bees. And they created these beehive fences around the boundaries of farms. And they found that fences actually led to 80% deterrence from the area. There were significantly less elephants breaking into farms that had these beehive fences. So a really nice way of thinking innovatively about how we can use an animal's behavior to help reduce potential conflict with humans. And then finally, we can think about how we use behavior in relation to things like captive breeding programs and translocation, which are really important tools when we need to address things like having a declining or critically endangered population. Conservation breeding has a really long history of using behavioral research, using things like social context and mate choice to help improve breeding success. So here we're going to focus instead on translocations, which also really require good information on the behavior of the species that you're moving. So you need to understand, interactions between behavior, age, sex, ontogeny. Do they need to, how flexible are they in their behavior? So they need to learn from other individuals in order to successfully be released in an area. So we need to understand their behavior to first determine if a translocation is feasible, to plan and prepare for it, and then to actually make it successful. So a great example of this comes from conservation biologists who were trying to establish a new breeding population of Stevens kangaroo rats, which are highly endangered, to new nature reserves in California. But all of the initial attempts at this kept failing. And they started to think that maybe this was because of the lack of what we call deer enemies. So the deer enemy effect is when territorial residents have less aggression towards neighbors and rivals that they already know than towards strangers. And this is because if you already know your rival, you already know your neighbor, then you can spend less time, defending against them, less energy fighting them, less risk of injury because their threat level is already assessed. So researchers moved 99 of these kangaroo rats, and they let about half of them keep their neighbors. And then they did another half where they mixed unfamiliar pairs. And they found that indeed, those who had dear enemies, those who were moved with their neighbors, fought less and had more offspring than those that had unfamiliar neighbors. And so this really nicely demonstrates, right, that understanding their territorial behavior and this social context was critical to making translocation successful. So in particular, we can consider how to utilize and apply what we call sensory-sensitive management to conservation. So species interact with a lot of different components of their landscape, with each other, with other species, through many different sensory systems that they use to make decisions. And so sensory-sensitive management can help improve reserve design. It can be used to more effectively avoid human conflict, and it can be used in things like translocation. So conservation measures that change elements of the environment, of the spatial and social environment, are going to change how a species actually perceives it, and this is going to change their behavior. And so we can use sensory sensitive management, especially when it's the animal's behavior itself that's the issue and that needs to be changed. So we can use different stimuli, visual, auditory, or olfactory, to really grab an animal's attention and try to make them do something different, to elicit a different type of response. And so, for instance, we can use signals to help encourage recolonization or movement to a new area. So this was done successfully with endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrows who they were trying to move to more suitable breeding areas in the Florida Everglades. And so they used songs of conspecifics, and this helped attract these sparrows to these new breeding areas very successfully. We can also use signals to discourage movement of animals to an area. This might mean that we need to increase their ability to perceive a certain stimuli. So for instance, in order to help reduce aircraft collisions with birds, there's been a lot of efforts to try to develop lighting systems that are especially attuned to the avian visual system to help them avoid aircrafts. So this shows, right, it's really important that we understand the basic morphology of our species' sensory system, how their organs work, what the ranges are of their sight, how they actually perceive the world around them to make these types of stimuli and systems effective. Because sometimes using stimuli does not produce the behavior that we want. So in this example, researchers were testing how effective a device was that would broadcast sounds at high frequencies to try to deter rabbits from agricultural fields. And they found that the device was really only effective up to 3 meters, and that rabbits actually habituated to it after just a few days. So perception does not always mean response. Some species may perceive a stimuli, but that does not mean it will guarantee the change in behavior that we want. And we have to be really careful that we are aware of the difference between how we perceive the world and how our target species perceives the world. So we really need a good understanding of the diversity of animal sensory systems and to consider how they are relevant for a species within its ecological environment. All right, so we have now covered all of these 3 themes. We've talked about animal behaviors, how they are impacted by anthropogenic activity, how they can be used as behavioral indicators, and how they can be used to shape behavior-based management. And of course, these themes do not exist on their own, but they are closely linked to one another. So an anthropogenic impact on animal behavior might be detected by using behavioral indicators. And this might necessitate the need for more conservation action, which can then be evaluated using behavioral indicators. And our behavior-based management plans are essentially meant to address anthropogenic impacts, and they might also be meant to change how animals behave in response to our anthropogenic activity. So these themes should be used to really guide research and help build upon previous understandings so that we can help address conservation concerns. And furthermore, we're going to come back to our original idea of how we ask questions in behavior, because we should really continue to think about these different levels of analysis of our questions. Ultimate questions are pretty clearly linked to conservation because they're about essentially fitness, how well an animal is surviving and reproducing. But proximate level questions are really important too. They'll help us understand the developmental context for behaviors, which might be important for management. Or as we've just seen, mechanistic research will provide information on how animals perceive their environment, which is going to be a very important thing when we make conservation decisions. So I'll end here with this nice quote that to develop more effective programs, conservation biologists must fully recognize the value of integrating proximate and ultimate behavioral studies. As you guys have seen, behavior is a fascinating, amazing field, but it's also really important for enacting effective conservation work. And so, again, I'll do a little plug if you want to learn more about this, if you want to dive into the data of this, to actually see how we can collect data, analyze that data to make conservation decisions. Check out my course that we'll be running this summer. And so, with that, I think we have some time for any questions that you all have. Otherwise, it was really great speaking with you all. And I hope that I hear from some of you. I'll also drop my email in the chat. So, if you have any questions and want to reach out to me, please do. I would love to hear from you.
Thanks, Stefanie. That was fantastic. Definitely have to sign up for your class, which I was already planning on. So I'll give folks a couple of seconds before I start asking questions myself.
Okay.
So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. And I'll go ahead and put another link in for the Wildlife Wednesday program. You can access links to our recordings of these presentations from there as well. While we're waiting for questions, I'll reiterate the significance, as much as I hate that word, of trying to think like our study species. I'm more on the research side than management most of the time, but I see so often that people try to view the world of their focal species through our senses. And I think we're missing a lot by doing that.
It's hard. Animals that sense through chemicals, that see ultraviolet light. It's a whole different sensory perception world than what we have. So it's important to think about, but it can be very hard for us to kind of wrap our head around their perceptions of the world.
Agreed. I work with bears for the most part, and trying to think of viewing a world through our olfactory system. You know, their acuity may be several orders of magnitude greater than ours. How do we possibly think that way and try and design, like in my case, monitoring programs that accurately reflect their sensory systems? It's yeah, I think it's way overlooked. That's right. I don't have more questions. You covered so
Covered
many
everything. Nothing to
incredible
ask.
species. Oh yeah, going back to your first, do you see the question there?
Yes, yes, yes. That is a foraging strategy to try to kind of flush out prey, is the kind of paddling that the goal was doing.
I've also was wondering what you've seen in terms of paradigm shifts. Is it really difficult in the behavior realm to get people to view things differently? Do theories tend to hang on longer than they should, perhaps? Have you seen much of that in your work?
I think there's a lot more intersection than there used to be, but yeah, I think between behavior and conservation, it tended to be kind of siloed. Um, and I mean, there's a lot of behavior for behavior's sake, which again, I think is important, and we need that baseline information to make conservation effective. Um, and so I think more of that communication needs to happen, but I think it is. I, I, I hope that it is. The people I know it is. So, um, yeah, I think it's definitely a field that's growing, and we're seeing more of that importance.
Adrian asked a question about courses. I'm not sure if you're referring to just wildlife classes or behavioral classes or classes in general. Feel free to reach out to our education coordinator anytime, or any of us, if you have specific course questions. Otherwise, we try and keep the web pages for individual classes updated in terms of future offerings and the options for them.
Ecosystem restoration and wildlife reintroductions. Um, that's a good question. I think I would have to think about it. Jeff, do you have any resources you can think of off the top of your head?
Same, I'd have to do some work on that. Mostly my exposure has been through talks of adding bears into the Yellowstone ecosystem for grizzly bear recovery, and and activity among recovery populations, lower 48 states. So there's absolutely a lot of work, whether it's on the behavioral side, genetics side, just general life history, to make sure that they align with the recipient population. Yeah, I'd have to do some homework on that.
Yeah. Meredith, feel free to email me as a reminder, and I can also dig into that for you. Yeah, I just can't think of anything on the top of my head, but I'd be happy to chat.
Meredith, are you thinking in particular taxa, a group, perhaps, or just in general?
Hi, Jeff. I am, I guess birds, possibly my interest overall is in ecosystem restoration, and I haven't really identified specifically what taxa would make the most sense. But I'm a master's student, and I'm going to be working on a project actually related to phenology mismatches, and I'd like to blend the two interests basically for my thesis.
I do know some people who've been heavily involved in that realm. Marquetta Zamova, I believe, is at North Carolina State now. She was at University of Montana with Scott Mills and the team working on snowshoe hare mismatch. And Diana Lafferty is working in that as well. Those are a couple of good names, I think, to start with.
Okay, great.
Looks like a question about your course, Stephanie.
Yeah, sorry, what do you mean by SIDS?
Sorry, small island developing states.
Ah, thank you. Okay. Um, I don't touch on that specifically, but I'm also always looking for, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity in the course for you to kind of dive into your own research and to investigate things on your own. So if that's something you're specifically interested in, you would absolutely have that opportunity. And I'm always looking for ways to update things too. So I'd be happy to provide more examples of that throughout the course. It doesn't currently have any specifically to that, other than kind of general talks of kind of small island effects in terms of movement and how that impacts evolution and things like that.
I'll go ahead and read Andrea, sorry, his question because these don't show up in the recording. How do you go about considering positive impacts on one species while it may be negative for another, i.e. reintroducing a species into an area which may have huge negative implications for another? How do you decide which is more important? Definitely some very high profile examples, maybe involving owls. What's your response there, Stephanie?
Yeah, I mean it's a critical question to think about. And yeah, it can be very difficult and a lot of times, right, we don't necessarily do a good job at predicting what the impacts are going to be, which is why reintroductions should be really well planned and we should really, they need a lot of this understanding of the native behavior that an animal is being introduced into, because without that, there's going to be a lot of impacts on the community. It's going to cause community shifts. And so something that we do talk about a bit in the course is how, who's making those decisions, because that's a really important thing to think about is who are the stakeholders involved and who is going to be ultimately making those decisions about which species we're prioritizing or not. And so that can be a really important thing to make sure that there is a lot of like local representation in those decisions, to make sure that it's not kind of a foreign body that's saying this is the most important species and this is what we need to prioritize, and that voices are really heard about that, because yeah, it's not an easy thing to decide which is more important or even figuring out what the impacts are going to be to begin with. So it's a really important question and not one with an easy answer.
Sometimes it's legal. If it's recovering an endangered species, for example, like Mexican gray wolves, maybe that reintroduction is the only way to accomplish that. Not that it makes the decision any easier.
Yeah.
Kate Doyle has a hand raised. You want to go ahead, Kate?
Yes, hi. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. I don't want to spark any debate. So over most of my life, I've sort of been keeping my eye on the California condor for whatever reason. That story has always fascinated me. I've always been interested in it. all the recovery and effort that's gone into that population. And a few years ago, I was at a conference and I might have borderline offended the presenter. But my view is that particular project wasn't a success because researchers have to feed these birds because they're not hunting successfully on their own. And you touched about it a little bit in your answer to the previous person, but I imagine that's dictated, who determines what is a success in those type of recovery efforts. And like, if to me, being able to forage is a fundamental behavior that if you can't do it well, then, so I'm just curious your take. And if you have resources for me that I can look more into, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would probably agree with you that, right, there are certain behaviors that would be metrics for a species being successful or not. And foraging, as I talked about, is a major important thing that species are doing that they need to be able to do on their own. So it is whether recovery is actually successful or not is another difficult metric that, again, will depend on who's determining that and who's measuring it. But I think, the amount of intervention that's continuously needed by humans to make a species survive, is probably going to be an important metric there. And if there's a lot of intervention, like the condors, then, maybe we need to think about other methods for conservation, so that they can start to build those behaviors more independently. I don't have any, again, resources on the top of my head, but again, if you want to email me, I'd be happy to dig into it a little bit more and see if I can find anything.
Some of those are just steps in the process. The Mexican wolf, not the same example. They've had to do supplementary feeding to reduce conflicts with the ranchers at times, and that's part of the plan, with the goal of eventually having a fully self-sustaining, ecologically operational population.
Yeah, the hard part with all of these things is time, that a lot of them take a substantial amount of time and funding over a long amount of time. And if that funding fluctuates, or, if you don't, those metrics just take a really long time to see a success, especially for a species that's more long-lived. So it's just going to be kind of a longer process that can be harder to see those success metrics, than species that might be shorter-lived and can kind of reproduce more quickly. So you'll see a lot of differences in how we measure success for different types of species.
I see we're a bit past the hour. If folks have more questions, feel free to reach out. I'll go ahead and offer up Stefanie. She put her email in earlier.
Yeah.
Or reach out to any of us at CWS. Again, thank you everyone for tuning in today. Really appreciate the support and the interest in an amazing topic that touches on everything relevant to conservation, and one that does not get nearly enough attention in my experience. Thank you, Stefanie, for a fantastic talk. Really appreciate it. Look forward to your class starting. Plug for the next Wildlife Wednesday to celebrate Sea Turtle Week. We have Dr. Melania Lopez presenting on her research and conservation efforts for sea turtles, which will be another fantastic talk. Who doesn't love sea turtles? So we will see folks then. Again, feel free to check out the site and make suggestions for topics you like or classes, and feel free to share our recordings with friends and colleagues. With that, I will stop the recording.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for your questions. And yes, please be in touch. I'd be happy to chat more about any of these things.